The relationship dates back, of course, with our CEO, President and CEO, Dr. John Duke Anthony, visiting Oman during the 1970s when things were changing, which our speakers will talk about, and when His Majesty ascended to the throne. I also wanted to bring to your attention that back on the 16th of October, 1998, the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations was pleased to host, along with 33 other American business, academic, and military institutions, His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said. At that time, on the 16th of October, the National Council, along with these other organizations, President Carter conveyed the International Peace Award to His Majesty. His Majesty, through the foreign minister responsible for foreign affairs, Yusuf bin Alawi Abdullah. At that time, His Majesty remarked, and I underscore these words because I think they're really very important as we try to move forward and understand each other and respect each other and appreciate each other. His Majesty remarked on the 16th of October, 1998, and I quote, "We believe that when nations and cultures, despite their differences, are able to communicate effectively with each other, they move naturally towards peace. We believe that humankind is inherently peace-loving, and so we also believe that all, individually and collectively, have a sacred duty to pursue the cause of peace, and that in fulfilling this duty, we help humankind to realize its destiny," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a message that is true and constant, particularly in today's world and during our political, I call silly season. But in any event, at this point in time, I'd like to shift the program and ask Rhonda Fahmy to come forward, along with Professor Linda Pappas-Funch, so that we can turn to the discussion portion of today's afternoon program. Yes. We're going to wear you up, you gentlemen. Come. Please, just don't trip. Yeah, that would be good.
Ready? Great. Well, thank you very much, Pat, and welcome to all of you on behalf of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. We are so delighted to be hosting this event today with what I would call our longtime friend and ally, Linda Funch. I'd like to welcome all of you again, as Pat said, but particularly the Ambassador, Hanena El-Mougheri. Your Excellency, we're so delighted that you've joined us here today. It's really, truly an honor. And we'd also like to thank all of you. We officially have a packed house here. I hope that everyone has been able to get their copy of this wonderful book, which I received on Friday. And I'm glad to tell you, I think it was Friday night, Pat, that Pat was able to deliver one of the first copies to me. And I'm happy to say that I finished it. As I was telling Linda last night, I was flying home from Houston, and I finished the last chapter last night. So it is a wonderful book. And with that, I'd like to turn to Linda with the first question. Linda, why did you write this book, Oman Reborn, Balancing Tradition and Modernization?
Well, I'm a longtime student of the Middle East for my entire adult life. Lived, worked, and studied in the region. And I wanted to write this book, which was a privilege, by the way, because Oman is truly a good news story from the Middle East. And don't we need that? In so many ways, Oman departs from the violence, the sectarian divisions, the ugliness, the warfare with which we are bombarded on a regular basis. So I wanted to spread the good news, essentially, by telling the story of Oman.
Terrific. Playing on that theme, why is it that you think Oman is underreported in the media, particularly in the international media? I mean, I understand why it's underreported in the US media, but in the international media, why don't people talk enough about Oman and their contributions, both historically and presently?
It's a great irony, and it's a great oversight, because I think people would be very receptive to hearing the story of Oman, but it is the exception, not the rule. They say if it bleeds, it leads. That is not the case in Oman. Oman is a relatively stable, peaceful, prosperous, optimistic place, and that rarely makes the headlines. So Oman is shrouded in a certain mystique. I've noticed even in my travels throughout the Middle East, whereas people may have heard about Oman, they know little about the country. They have a basically positive feeling about it, but they're not sure why. And that is one of the reasons I wrote this book.
Terrific. So I want to take you back to when you first traveled to Oman. What were those circumstances? So let's talk a little personal history here, because I think when authors write books, they oftentimes, of course, reflect upon their personal experiences, and that, I think, certainly was the case. I think this is a great mix of your personal observations with historical details, which I found quite fascinating, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my favorite passages in the book a little bit later. But when did you first travel? What were the circumstances? And obviously, Pat talked a little bit about how you returned through the National Council's auspices, but what were your first impressions, and then what was your sort of history in traveling back, including, by the way, the many times you traveled back to write this book?
My first visit to Oman was in 1974. I was living in Beirut, working with the Ford Foundation, and I was privileged to be part of an international team that was sent to Oman at the request of the government to assess the needs for women in rural areas, children, nutrition, medical care. And this team, which we formed with the help of UNESCO and UNICEF, eventually suggested programs and priorities for the government. During that time, we had the opportunity to travel to very remote areas of Oman. Now, bear in mind, this was only 4 years after His Majesty, the Sultan, had assumed rule over Oman. It was a very different place. It was a place in 1974 which seemed to be fixed in time. Coming from Beirut in the 1970s, the Paris of the Middle East, Oman seemed like the other side of the moon. It was charming, but it was certainly undeveloped. But there was a sense of promise. There was a sense of hope. The citizenry that we met was very excited about the prospect of working with the new Sultan, who at that time was only in his early 30s.
Terrific. I think an important overall theme to this book is your distinguishing between modernization and westernization, which is a real, I think, important topic to discuss when we're talking generally about the Middle East, but particularly with respect to Oman. So can you elaborate a little bit on that idea of modernization and westernization and how it's particularly relevant within the Omani context?
Yes, this is very important because the Omani paradigm for development has distinguished between the two. And what is the distinction between the two? Westernization, which used to be thought of as the path to development, is a mere, often blind imitation of all that is West, Western institutions, Western cultural trappings. If it's Western, it must be good. The problem with Westernization is that it inhibits creativity and entrepreneurship and enterprise. It is blind imitation. Modernization, on the other hand, genuine modernization, which I believe is largely what we find in Oman, is the process by which a company or institution selects what is most appropriate, what is best for that society, for that country, and chooses that. It's just kind of a more selective approach. Mm-hmm. And this is what really struck me about Oman. We haven't talked about my return visit, but 32 years after my original visit, I returned to the Sultanate and was very much impressed with not only the way it had modernized, but the fashion of its modernizing approach, which was genuine, which was rooted in its culture and history, which was very selective. This was no accident. This is something that His Majesty the Sultan was very, very keen about, and he articulated this path from the very earliest years of his reign, that blind imitation would be a mistake in the case of Oman. So you find in Oman a modern country which is still uniquely Omani, okay? It could be nowhere else but in Oman. And I could go on and on, but
Terrific. Please. Sure. And let me just mention, after Linda and I are done discussing a little bit of these questions, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. So we're happy to do that. So two of my favorite chapters in this book was about, and I think they're great in the context of sort of historical and present day, is the role of the Sultan and the relationship with the United States. So the first one is in chapter 6. It's entitled Foreign Relations, A Policy of Mutual Respect. You talk about Oman and the United States from a historical perspective. The friendship between the United States and Oman is as old as the United States itself. Since the birth of the American Republic, Oman has stood as one of America's most trusted allies in the Middle East. After Morocco, Oman was the second country in the Arab world to establish diplomatic relations with the young republic. In the early 19th century, it became the first country in the region to send a political mission to the United States. Of note was the warm relationship between our president, Martin Van Buren, and the Sultan. In a letter dated December 25th, 1839, there was the transmittal of gifts from the Sultan to the United States President, President Van Buren. It said, "Sir, I have the pleasure of sending your excellency through friendship 2 good-bred Arab horses, 1 string containing 150 pearls, 2 separate large-size pearls, 1 carpet, 1 bottle of oil of roses, 4 cashmere shawls, 5 demijohns of rose water, also 1 gold-mounted sword to please accept with other mentioned articles, hoping you will be pleased to accept the trifles from your friend, Said bin Sultan." It sounds like my closet. No, just kidding. I wish. Tell me a little bit about that and what has happened to those particular gifts, because they have a wonderful place in American history.
Yes, indeed. The Sultan sent those gifts with an emissary by the name of Ahmed bin Aman, who was feted in New York society at the time. The Tribune in New York wrote about him with great enthusiasm. He was the toast of the town, a gentleman in every way. And those gifts were given to the U.S. president, but this in fact was a precedent in U.S. history, because in the young republic, no head of state had previously been gifted with such largesse by a foreign power. So the question was discussed in Congress. What should be the disposition of these goods after all? Would it be appropriate for the president to retain them? And they agreed, no, that would not be correct. So the horses were sold at auction, and the proceeds were funneled into the U.S. Treasury. But for the rest of the gifts, the material gifts, there was a new institution that was just being founded in Washington, D.C., which became a home for these gifts, and that institution was the Smithsonian Institution. So the Omani gifts really formed the core of the Smithsonian's first collection. In fact, one of the very large Persian rugs that was part of that treasure was on display until very recently at the Museum of American History. You may have seen the displays of the First Lady inaugural gowns with mannequins. Well, those mannequins were standing on that very rug, which Ahmed bin Aman had brought to the United States in the 1840s.
Love that story. It was fabulous. So let's flash forward now and talk a little bit about the role of His Majesty Sultan Qaboos in this rebirth or renaissance, if you will, of Oman. And I'm sure you can give many, many examples of that from your experience. But one in particular struck me as sort of indicative of that from the book. It's entitled The Arab Awakening. So during the turbulent succession of events that sent the Middle East into a tailspin in 2011, a period known as the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening, several governments were toppled in quick succession, first in Tunisia, followed by Egypt and Libya, and to a large extent Yemen, while the status quo throughout the region was seriously undermined by months of violent protests and demands for regime change. The government of Oman weathered the regional tsunami wiser, but nonetheless intact, while popular protests, organized largely through text messaging and social media, spurred a number of social, economic, and political reforms. One Omani official viewing these events through a longer historical lens insisted that their impact on the evolution of the state of Oman was limited. We've had our Arab awakening, he said, and our Arab awakening was in the 1970s. Talk a little bit about the very interesting response by the government of Oman and how they dealt with, in particular, how Sultan Qaboos dealt with those protests within Oman and why it didn't go the way of some of their Arab brethren.
Well, thank you. That was a fascinating period in recent Omani history. It's worth noting here that during the so-called Arab Spring in Oman, while people took to the streets asking for demanding more jobs and higher pay, and in some cases the forgiveness of private loans, there were no calls for the overthrow of the government. The admiration, the respect, the love, in fact, which the Omanis certainly demonstrate for their ruler of now 45 years is really quite astonishing. Another reason this is a story that must be told. It certainly flies in the face of recent governments in the Middle East. But in the, after the protests, His Majesty took these complaints very seriously indeed, and sent delegations out, sent emissaries out to meet with the people, to engage in dialogue, because the Omani political system is really founded on a dialogue, a shura, a consultation kind of notion. Discussion, dialogue is very, very essential. They heard the complaints. The government declared that they were going to make 55,000 public service jobs available for young people, mostly in the security sectors. And then one of the issues one of the public issues dealt with the questions of perceived corruption in government, in the government. And in fact, many ministers were dismissed by His Majesty after that event. And many of the new ministers who replaced their predecessors were young technocrats, PhDs in many, many cases, And then there was increased representation from the Shura Council, of course, in the government as well. The Shura Council being the lower elected house of the Omani government. Another way for the public will, public sentiment to be incorporated into the decision-making process in Oman.
So we were talking about that earlier. That would be as if President Obama cleared out half his cabinet and put some members of Congress from the House of Representatives into those positions as a way to sort of quell the uprising. So with all of that, how would you then view the Sultan's role internationally within the region itself, within the Arab world moving forward? What is it that you see? How is that going to evolve? Or do you see much of the same strategy that is being employed now as far as Oman's relationship with, most of all, with its Arab neighbors? Since they're changing, I should say.
Yeah, that's an enormous question. Of course, the Sultan's role is pivotal, is major, is central. There would likely not have been an Omani Renaissance, an Omani rebirth without His Majesty the Sultan. He led it. He envisioned what it would be, starting with healthcare and education and improvement of infrastructure. This is a country which has been catapulted in less than 50 years from a 14th century medieval-style potentate to a forward-looking, progressive 21st century nation on the move. It has been astonishing. And to a very, very large extent, of course, the credit needs to go to the Sultan. And the way in which he was able to unite his people around common cause, to impress upon them the importance of their history and traditions in moving forward was central also to the theme. Help me out with
his relationship with the changing neighborhoods, certainly.
The changing neighborhood.
And the leaders.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's a very tricky business these days in that region.
Sultan Qaboos, I believe, is viewed as an elder statesman among his fellow leaders in the Middle East. He has been in power for 45 years. His family has ruled Oman since the 1740s. This is a tough act to follow. So he is viewed with great respect, but what is very important about Oman, I believe, is that while it certainly is a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council and it works with its neighbors in the region, it is also insistent on its independence and its sovereignty. It does not take the lead from anyone. The Omanis decide what is best for them. So, for example, it might surprise not a few people to learn that while Oman is an oil-producing state, not a large one, but a reasonable oil-producing state in the Middle East, it is not a member of OPEC. It decided back in the day that OPEC was not in the best interests of Oman. So there is an independence. The sovereignty of the country is extremely important. Oman plays a very unique role among its neighbors because it believes in being a friend to all, an enemy to none. It is on equally good terms with the Iranians as it is with the Americans. And in this respect, Oman has been invaluable in moderating, mediating, facilitating exchanges between the two countries, including the nuclear arms agreement, which was recently accepted between Iran and its Western neighbors. Oman was instrumental in facilitating those meetings, making itself available to both parties. It serves as a mediator in hostage crises. We certainly have seen that. Most recently, I believe several hostages were released from Yemen 2 weeks ago at the behest of the Sultanate. So while it is a very, very good neighbor, it is an independent entity in the region.
That's terrific. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you. I think it would now be appropriate to open up the questions from the audience. I believe we have a microphone, so we would ask.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you do have questions, we have notepads and we also have pens. Just raise it, and one of the staff from the National Council seated at the table will go around and collect your questions. So feel free to write down your questions. Raise your hand, and our ushers will collect them.
Great, okay, fine. And I'll be happy to ask those questions as they come in. So Linda, let's continue until we get our first question up here. So when are you going to return? When is your next trip? And will you be going on a book tour for the book?
Inshallah. I don't know. I don't have immediate plans, but I do hope to return to Oman very soon.
Right.
It's been actually too long. I have been writing and editing and putting the final touches on this book for the past year. I've not been back to Oman for about a year and a half. So I'm aching to go and to possibly work on collecting research for my next book.
Terrific. Well, the first question from the audience is one that I'm sure everyone's been thinking about, and one that I didn't ask. I left it for the audience to ask. Of course, succession and the whole idea of succession. Everyone likes to ask that question, but particularly with Oman, when not much is known, certainly, about it. So can you talk a little bit about succession and who might, in speculation, the Sultan might be grooming to take over?
It's an important question, and it's one that is always asked at groups like this, because His Majesty Sultan Qaboos is certainly larger than life, and it will be impossible to follow him. But I notice that this question seems to be a preoccupation of people more from people outside of Oman than people within Oman, and I'm going in that direction. His Majesty was absent from Oman from July of 2014 to March of 2015. He was being treated in Munich for an illness. And the pundits were going crazy. Oh my gosh, Oman is going to fall apart. What happens if His Majesty should pass on? Again, the columns were full of doom and gloom scenarios. Well, alas, Oman remained intact. And His Majesty did return in good health in March of this year to spontaneous celebrations throughout the country, young and old, rich and poor, rural and urban. And I asked an Omani friend of mine, well, what about these concerns about succession? And he said something to me which I paraphrase in the book, which I think says it all. He said, well, His Majesty has spent more than 4 decades building institutions in this country, making it a functioning, modern state. He was absent from this state for 8 months, and it carried on, and it functioned. And so their concern is certainly with his health, but not with they're not concerned that the country will all the progress that has been made will be undermined in any way. In terms of succession, there is a mechanism in place, and that mechanism is outlined in the Basic Law, which is effectively Oman's constitution. And that provision suggests that when the throne becomes vacant, the Royal Family Council will meet and come to a consensus on who the successor should be. But there's an outline, there are parameters here. The successor should be a male, should be a member of the royal family that is descended from Sultan Turki bin Said. The successor should be of an Omani mother and an Omani father. If the Royal Family Council is unable to come to a decision, a consensus, on the choice for successor, then this whole discussion will move to the Defense Council, and headed by the chairman of the 2 houses of parliament and the chairman of the Supreme Court and 2 senior deputies. That council will meet and open the envelope which Sultan Qaboos bin Said has written, and that envelope will be written with his choice of successor. But the important thing here, I think, is that the first body is given the choice to select their own. If they cannot come to an agreement, then his choice is considered. So things will fall into place.
Terrific. We have so many questions. Look at this. This is great. This is covered in the book, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about it since our audience hasn't quite had the chance yet to read the book. Tell us about the population of Oman, particularly in the traditional sense, and the education reforms and the rights of women, because there's another fabulous chapter about that. I know.
Yeah,
We've got a good
particularly I
15
devote a
minutes.
lot of time to women in
Yeah.
Oman and their role in traditionally, historically in Oman and society, but also in their role in the modernization process. So the first question was about, sorry, the first part of that?
The population.
Population,
So the traditional.
yes. The population
right.
is extremely diverse. It's diverse linguistically, ethnically, religiously. What do I mean by this? Well, Oman, as many of you may know, is home not only to people of the Sunni and Shia persuasion of Islam, but the third tradition in Islam, the Ibadi tradition. So there are three happily coexisting varieties of Islam in Oman. So religiously varied. Also, a significant number of non-Muslims in Oman, particularly Hindus, because there are many people from the subcontinent, the Asian subcontinent, who live, work in Oman, many for generations, Christians there as well. So it is religiously quite diverse. Linguistically diverse. I think it would be fair to say that until recently, whereas Arabic is obviously the predominant language and English gaining steam, another very important language in Oman is Swahili. Swahili, you ask? Well, because during Oman's illustrious, very interesting history, Oman governed vast swaths of coastal East Africa. Which is another important point to make about Oman, that it is historically and in the future will continue to be a maritime country. Oman is much more outward looking to the sea and beyond than it is to the desert at its back, which also has, I think, made the Omanis somewhat different from many of their neighbors in the region, because there's a certain cosmopolitanism about Omanis based on their interaction with people of varying cultures and traditions throughout history. And I know I'm off on a tangent.
The women's rights.
Women's rights.
Right.
My
Women's
goodness.
rights and education reform, right?
Yeah, well, from the very beginning, Qaboos bin Said made it clear that women were to be an important part of the modernization process, an essential part of Oman's transformation into the modern age. And he frequently used the metaphor of a bird with two wings. Female and male, you need both wings to fly. And so our nation must fly with the two wings. And he has, probably more than any other modern leader that I know in the Arab or Islamic world, been a very vocal proponent of women's empowerment. Women have every right that men have. They have educational rights. In fact, they outnumber men in universities. They even outnumber the men in the number of Omanis who study abroad in postgraduate training and undergraduate training. Oman was the first country in the Gulf to appoint a woman minister, the Minister of Higher Education. And of course, we have among us today Her Excellency Ambassador Hunaina El Mughairi, who was the first Arab ambassador from the region to be appointed to the United States. Her sister, by the way, is the Oman's ambassador to the United Nations. So women are essential to Oman's development process.
Wonderful. So here's a question near and dear to my heart. You spoke a little bit about the fact that Oman has oil but is not a member of OPEC. So what, if anything, from your research, have you found that Oman is doing to prepare itself for a time when oil revenues are no longer sufficient to support the government? And frankly, that time may be now, looking at the price of oil worldwide.
Yeah. Well, the leadership in Oman has anticipated this day for quite a long time and had put into place years ago a program known as Omanization, the key element of which was and is the diversification of Oman's economy away from its reliance on hydrocarbon production. And toward this end, many measures have been put into place. One of the most promising, certainly, is the tourism sector. Oman is a natural. Here is a peaceful, stable, friendly, hospitable country with breathtaking vistas, scenic to a fault, very diverse. And the Omanis have invested quite a lot of money, have invited foreign investors to invest quite a lot of money in the tourism sector. I just have to say parenthetically here, because I always have to sort of smile to myself. When I visited Oman for the first time in 1974, our delegation stayed at the first hotel and only hotel in Muscat. That was the old El Felaj Hotel near the airport. Now you have 5-star hotels dotting the country, resorts, golf, everything you can possibly imagine. So it is a magnet for tourism, and that will be very important. Another element for Oman's economic diversification will be, and again, building upon its tradition as a maritime country, is the expansion of ports. Expansion and development of new ports, port facilities, airports, a national railway system is under construction. And again, Oman has 1,100 miles of coastline facing out toward the Indian Ocean. It is a natural transshipment destination. And with the expansion and modernization of these ports, that should also bring in a good deal of income. So I think between tourism and the trade and commerce sector, Oman will be just fine.
So diversification.
Absolutely.
That sounds great. We have quite a bit of questions, and you talk about this in your book. So another interesting factor here is the role of the Abadi traditional party, or the Abadi Islamic faith, which not a lot of folks know about. People are used to hearing Sunni, Shia, but in Oman there's a particular role that the Abadi Islamic faith has played throughout history, and perhaps is playing now as a role in the mediating factor. So you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yes and no, and this is something I've been cautioned about in my research with Omanis. Yes, Ibadism is another tradition within Islam, to be sure. It exists in Oman to a large extent, also in certain pockets of North Africa. Its theological differences with the other two sects are not great, but I would emphasize to this group, as I have learned, that in Oman, Omanis tend not to distinguish between Sunni and Shia and Abadi. They worship at each other's mosques, they work together, they intermarry. It is just another variation, but it is not a distinction. It's not something that people necessarily wear in their sleeves. There's a regionality to Ibadism. It generally prevails in the north, in the Nizwa area and so forth. But again, that is a distinction that I think academics and Westerners would make more than Omanis themselves, in my experience.
Interesting. Another great question about the region itself and Oman's role, a question about whether or not it could be an influencer in the Arab region. The question is particularly focused on whether or not Oman could use its good offices to moderate the Syrian and the Yemeni conflict, that perhaps Oman is uniquely positioned to be able to negotiate and moderate these conflicts. And as one of our audience members has said, perhaps because of their role as a friend to all and an enemy to none. So what do you see, if any, role that Oman might have in both Yemen and Syria?
It has been made clear to me during my research that a commandment, if you will, a pillar of Oman's foreign policy is non-interference in the affairs of other states. Given that, I don't see Oman taking an active role as a mediator, making its good offices available, inviting people to talk, as it did in the case of the United States and Iran back in the day. That's fine, but it does not care for anyone to involve itself in their business, nor does it care to involve itself in anyone else's business. So I think that would be my short answer.
Okay, interesting. So two of these questions sort of play on that, which is some would say Oman is quiet, and it pushes for quiet public diplomacy in the media, lobbies less than its foreign government neighbors. Is the low-key profile part of Oman's strategy? In other words, is it intentional? And because of Oman's reputation, if you will, that surrounds Sultan Qaboos, do you think the Omanis will have an identity crisis post the Sultan, post Qaboos? Will they be searching for what they are after that, even though the succession may be clear? Will there be another rebirth afterwards?
Mm-hmm. Let me start with the second question first.
Mm-hmm.
The short answer is no, in my opinion. Omanis know very well who they are, what they are, where they come from. They're the oldest independent state in the region. They have a sense of national identity. They have a sense of cohesion. They pride themselves on that. I think regardless of who leads Oman, Omanis will always be secure in who they are. They are, as one individual in this room mentioned to us years ago at a group, they are comfortable in their own skins. They know who they are. Now, the first question was?
With respect to the identity crisis.
No, again, no identity crisis. Oh, why don't they lobby more about it?
Yeah.
One of the most endearing qualities about visiting Oman would be the Omanis themselves. Omanis follow what Frederick Barth called an ideology of politeness, which is really quite astonishing. They're generally quiet. They're not a belligerent people. They are humility, I would say. They are characterized by humility, and they don't tend to really sort of blow their own horn, if you know what I mean. And I always find it delightful when I'm there and doing research and collecting data. They're genuinely happy that somebody is doing that, but they're just sort of comfortable just dealing with the day-to-day exigencies in Oman, and they're not really about show.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of the military in Oman and its relationship to the Sultan?
Well, of course, very important. The Sultan comes from the military in Oman, and had it not been for his military genius in the early years of his reign in quelling the war in Dhofar, we might not have the success story that we have today. He is a military man par excellence. He had his military education at the Royal Military Academy in England, in Sandhurst, and served with the British for some years before returning to Oman. So he is a brilliant military strategist, and that has been demonstrated. Military is important, obviously, and very strong, has an excellent relationship with the United States and the United Kingdom, and certainly is the backbone of Oman's security.
So finally, I will give you this two-part question that focuses on Oman's relationship with the United States. So one of our audience members wants to know what the immigration pattern is of Omanis coming to the United States. We talked a little bit about this over lunch with respect to some of our talented foreign students from Oman. We have one of those students with us today at George Washington University. Is that right? It's wonderful to have you here with us. And then about Oman's rich culture. How does it introduce its culture and the Arabic language in cities such as Washington, D.C. And I think I knew the answer to this,
Yes,
but I'll let you answer.
You do. Well, in terms of immigration patterns, it is true that Omanis study in many countries. There are Sultan Qaboos chairs, academic chairs in major universities. In the United States, for example, right here at Georgetown University, at William and Mary University in Virginia, and others, and throughout the world. So academics, education, and healthcare, if I haven't said this before, have been and continue to be the pillars of the Omani success story. But what happens most frequently, in my experience, and I think by design, is that once Omani students have the opportunity to study abroad, they are very eager to return to Oman. We do not have the brain drain going on in Oman. They return to Oman eager to contribute to the country's modernizing enterprise and the country's growth. And the second part of that was
How they introduce their culture and language here in Washington, D.C.
Right here in Washington, we have the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center, which is a marvelous vehicle for introducing and disseminating Omani culture and history. History also is so important to the modernization of Oman, because when I made the distinction between westernization and modernization, Oman consistently draws on its history and heritage in its modernizing plans. For example, why do tourists love Oman? Why do Omanis love Oman? Because they can visit the castles and the forts and the places of historic interest there. So the history of Oman has been brought to life. I have two photos in the book. Did you notice them?
I did.
Of the fort in Nizwa, and it was pure serendipity. I took a photo of this fort in 1974 before Reconstruction. And then the same view about 3 years ago after Reconstruction. And it's quite remarkable what they have done to preserve and inculcate in their youth and their citizens the proud history and heritage that they all share. Of course, Oman has several UNESCO World Heritage sites as well, which are extremely important. Archaeological sites, which are just stunning in their potential and in what we have learned from earlier civilizations. This, after all, is the land of frankincense, yeah? The land of Sinbad the Sailor. It's quite remarkable.
Wonderful. Well, Linda, we want to thank you at the National Council, of course, for your wonderful, wonderful book, certainly for joining us today in the launch of your book. I think there's definitely two things you've accomplished is one, explaining in detail what Oman is about, but also encouraging many of us who have not traveled to Oman to certainly, through your book and through your eyes, to want to visit that wonderful country. I would say one of our best ambassadors from Oman, Frances Cook, our former U.S. ambassador, is here with us today. And she's probably one of the best ambassadors. I heard much about Oman from Frances over the years. But you really, I think, brought it to life here in the book. And if anything, I'd love to take a trip with both Frances, Ambassador Al-Muhiri, and Linda to Oman. So let's go.
Let's go.
Thank you very
And
much.
Rhonda, while you go with them, we'll take Ambassador Schmier also with us. So,
Thank you. That was great.
any event,
Ambassador Schmier.
ladies and gentlemen,
right.
Linda will be available in a few minutes outside near the elevators to personally autograph one of the books if you'd like. So please take your books with you. If you did not receive a copy of the book, the publisher has noted and informed us that they will be doing another print run of the book. So please make sure that the staff at the council gets your business card. It's been a real pleasure, privilege, and honor to have you here. Thank you for coming and making the time out of your busy afternoon here in Washington. Have a safe trip. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. You were great. Oh my God, you were.